Erev Tov. Whoa, that's loud. I guess we fixed the sound. Well done, Seth. That's fantastic. Erev Tov, everyone. Good evening. I'm Rabbi Dan Moskovitz, the senior rabbi here at Temple Sholom, and it is a pleasure to be able to host this event on behalf of the whole community. We're just the room, but it's special to be able to be the room for this very important and a conversation that I'm looking forward to, and I'm sure you are as well. I want to acknowledge first that we are and express gratitude for the land on which we work, pray, and gather as a community, which is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We're grateful to have the opportunity to freely worship and gather on this land, and we ask God's blessings upon it and upon all of us. Amen.
Amen.
So I was asked to introduce our speakers, but they also said, well, you're going to comment on what's going on in the world, and I was like, well, there's a lot going on. There could be a lot of commenting. But our thoughts very much are in Montreal, as they are across our country right now. And I'm sure, as will come up tonight, at the core of what is going to be discussed is the, I want to say unprecedented, but it's not unprecedented. We know that. Unprecedented in my lifetime. Rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Jew hatred in our country. I moved to Canada 13 years ago, and I never imagined that I would be encountering, as you have encountered, the kind of vitriol and violence and threats of violence that we are seeing. We pray and hope that everyone is safe in Montreal and that this stops, and that our political leaders and our civil leaders and leaders of all faith, my colleagues across the religious spectrum, stand up and speak up against hatred, and I'll say against anti-Semitism, full stop, and other hatreds, of course, but in this moment and in this time, to speak up against anti-Jewish hatred. It is a pleasure to have Richard Zussman here and Selina Robinson to share about Selina's book. I've gotten to know Richard a little bit because he calls me generally when I'm in my car on my way someplace for a quote about something that I didn't even know had happened yet, and he needs something pithy in that moment. But Richard, as I hope many of you know, has a long and storied career here in our community. He's won multiple Jack Webster Awards, including for his coverage of the 2018 BC wildfires and the 2017 confidence and supply agreement between the BC NDP and the BC Greens. He's won numerous awards, including the Edward R. Murrow Award for his coverage of BC politics and the wildfires. He's helped lead Global BC's coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic, continues to focus on the BC government. He has a master's in broadcast journalism from Newhouse School and Syracuse University and a bachelor's from Queen's University. And he's the co-author of a book on BC politics entitled A Matter of Confidence that chronicles the events in and around 2017's. Right?
Selina's got it.
I've got it right here.
Oh, there it is. Okay. I didn't think anything was funny in that. But yeah, he wrote that book. But we're actually here about the other book, which is in the other hand, and that is Selina's book. But I want to just introduce Selina, who we all know very, very well. I got to go to Israel with Selina on a Federation mission. Where'd Ezra go? Ezra's over there. And a number of us were on that trip. And I got to see, I would say, Selina in the wild, if you would. As we grappled with Israel in April of 2024, the country was still, and still is, very much in the throes of the trauma of October 7. But to be able to sit with Selina and to see her empathy, to see her brilliance and her insight, and then to sit after a couple of very long and challenging, emotionally challenging days over a glass of scotch, and to try to process all that we had encountered, is to really be in the presence of an incredibly strong and talented and insightful and compelling leader. We have been so fortunate, Selina, to have your leadership in our community for so many years, and in whatever new roles that you take on. In some ways, I'm kind of happy that you're freed from the restraints of politics, and the full Selina, which I don't think was ever constrained before, will be unleashed upon British Columbia. They have no idea what's coming. I will have more announcements at the very end, other than to say now that the book is available at the end of our program this evening, and Selina will sign that. I'll have some instructions regarding that. I want to also acknowledge Pat Johnson, who's in the back, who was so instrumental in pulling all of this together and work with Selina on the book. And all of the leaders, there are far too many that I can mention that are here in our community, those elected officials and previously elected officials and maybe future elected officials, and everyone else in our community that's come out to support this evening. I won't speak on behalf of Selina, but I will speak on behalf of our community to say that we feel your allyship, we need it, we count on it, and we are grateful for your support. And with that, I turn it over to you. The bima is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. So just to mention before we get started, the camera guy over there is mine for Global BC. So unless the Prime Minister quits between now and tomorrow at 6 o'clock, I will feature Selina's book tomorrow night on the News Hour. So let's hope we keep things okay through tomorrow night. Also want to mention what we've got here behind us. I know that many of you probably haven't had the chance to see the book yet, although many of you have bought it. It is already #1 on many charts on Amazon. So thank you to so many in the community for making that so. So Selina, congratulations on that. So Selina, tell us about the artwork.
Okay. So Kathleen is in the audience. She's probably right there. I see her right here. Kathleen Tennant is a community member in Coquitlam-Millardville, and she's been a very strong ally for the Jewish community. And I saw this art on her website, and I knew right away that it needed to be the cover for the book. So I'm just going to read a little bit about how she describes this artwork, and you'll understand why it's the cover of the book. Torn Fragments of Life was created on the day 6 hostages who had survived for almost 11 months in the most unimaginable of circumstances were found dead. I didn't know what to do with the thoughts that were swirling around in my head. They had survived so long, their family's pain, their horror. So I ripped up my art and created this piece. Each piece of torn paper placed firmly in place. My thoughts kept going back to Hirsch Goldberg Poland, whose arm had been blown off, and his parents, who did everything possible a parent can do to save their child. Torn Fragments of Life are the voice memos, text messages, phone calls, DMs I received from my Jewish friends and the followers thanking me for standing with them, thanking me for not being silent. I didn't understand why I was being thanked because I was just being me. Peace comes when terrorism is recognized for the evil it is and when that evil is destroyed. I have and always will be against hate. I have and always will stand with humanity, and that will always include those who are Jewish. Art by Kathleen Tennant.
So we're going to go the next 30, 45 minutes or so. I'm going to ask Selina some questions. You'll hear lots of bits in the book. We'll sort of do some questions. We'll do some reading. You know, some of you have read the book already. Many of you will read it. All of you know what the story's about. In politics, you know, there's this code that exists, right? You go into these rooms with caucus or cabinet, and there's silence, right? You deal with things within your group. What's happened to you has been so public. Why did you decide to write this book, to tell your story so soon after it existed, in the headlines, on the television, and so recent for you to live through?
So I wasn't planning to write a book. Others, well, mostly Pat, said, you should write a book. Mm-hmm. And a few others, Marcia Lederman said, oh yeah, what a great idea, wish I'd thought of that. And I thought, I'm not a writer. And then Marcia said, well, do you write your speeches? And I said, yeah. She said, you're a writer. Okay. And so I thought, okay, I had lots of ideas and lots of experience, lots of hurt feelings, and lots of frustration. And I thought, well, okay, I could start writing, and if I don't want to share it, I don't have to. That's the gift about writing. And so I started writing and writing and writing, and the experiences came in dribs and drabs, while the public part was the actual firing and my 4 crappy words, The words are crappy.
Yeah.
And no one's going to fire me over that. But there were lots of incidents before that. It was a culmination of many experiences that nobody knew about. And so I wanted people to understand that it wasn't just that one event. There was a ton of stuff that happened after October 7th that led to what happened, and that I had been doing behind the scenes that nobody knew about. And I thought, no, you need to understand. This is a big problem, folks, a very big problem, and we're going to have to deal with it, all of us.
Yeah, and the book isn't just about that. There's more to it, and you'll get into it. It's about Selina's life story. It's about the work that you did leading up into getting into elected life and then post-elected life. But you mentioned those 4 words, crappy piece of land. Looking back, do you regret saying that in that context of that online forum that you were doing?
Well, it would be silly to not regret it because it took on a life of its own. But I also have come to believe that the mob would have got me anyway. Because, well, first of all, I was already singled out at the BC NDP convention that happened in November. There were signs with my name on it and how, what a terrible human being I was because I was a Jew, essentially, or Zionist, but equivalent words. But the fact that they had 11,000 signatures within 48 hours calling for my head, it was like, no, you had to have this going on well before. So there was intent to get rid of probably the most prominent Jew. There are some prominent Jews in elected office back east, but certainly more prominent than any other Jew that was elected, and the only other Jew that was elected was George Amon. So I was the Jew in the crew. I was the one who did Jew wherever we went. I was the one who was speaking out against the hate that we were seeing that's directed towards Jews. And the mob didn't like that. So they wanted to get rid of me.
We spent a lot of time talking during that period. We've known each other a long time. I'm also a journalist. We had these conversations, and I think many people believe, and you write about this in the book, that things were going to blow over, it seemed. Yes. You were hearing that from people. We see this often in politics. People get outraged for a short period of time, then you have some time and it disappears. Yeah. When did you get that sense that this was not going to blow over, that things had become serious to a point that it led to these conversations where, the Premier ultimately asked for you to make a decision, and you talk about that in the book, about did you resign, did he fire you? You can explain it in your words. You can explain it in your words, but at what point did you know that this, in essence, was not going to blow over?
So the panel was on Tuesday. I describe it, hey, Rabbi, can I say shit in the shul? The stuff hit the fan a couple of days later. And I really did think that, okay, over the weekend, but as I point out, and as media helped, because these folks, including Richard, were like, it's going to blow over, and then called me and said, I don't think it's going to blow over. When the BC NDP had to cancel their fundraiser, which was on the Sunday night, and there was a 2-day caucus meeting, and I often wondered, if that caucus meeting wasn't happening, would there have been a different outcome? But I think the pressure was considerable. This was in many ways the first crisis that the Premier was going to be faced. Yeah. It was going to face. And it really was going to demand some significant principled leadership to see a way through. But I also know that I think when the imams got together and threatened government to say, you have an election in 6 months, and if you don't fire her, we will not give you access through our mosques to our communities. I think for me, that's when I think the other shoe fell, was that this was not tenable to the Premier and to the caucus.
I want to get to that issue about the role that religion plays in our politics now, because it is profound and it is having an impact, and as you alluded to, especially in an election year. Let's shelve it for a minute, because I want to focus in on the leadership issue that you mentioned, and that's going to lead us into the first passage that we want to hear from. David Eby, you mentioned it was his first test. You spend a lot of time in this book around his leadership. You write a lot about Matt Smith, his chief of staff, and a lack of leadership in many regards for both of them. You've known David Eby since you were both elected in 2013. What was the sense you got of some of these leadership failings that you believe led, and I know we're going to spend a bit of time later talking about John Horgan, but it's hard not to compare the two premiers you worked under. So let's just focus on the current premier first, and where do you think there were some failings of leadership here, or ultimately do you believe he felt he had no choice?
Well, first of all, I think any leader always has a choice. So can I say bullshit in the show, Rabbi? So you always have a choice. I'm a leader too. I've been a leader too. There's always a choice. And I think sometimes as leaders we're faced with the easy choices and the harder choices. And sometimes you want to take the easy route because the hard route is painful, there's uncertainty, there's angst, then you have to deal with all the side impacts of that hard choice. And so sometimes you say, well, I'll go with the easy choice and I'll deal with that fallout seems easier. The challenge I think as leaders that we have is, so what do your principles tell you to do? So if you're following your principles, that will tell you sometimes that you need to make the hard choice. Because if you make the easy choice, you compromise your principles. And that was the part that was really painful for me, and that continues to be really challenging for me when I engage with my progressive community, because I still consider myself a progressive. All of you conservatives out there, I am still not on team conservative. And so I do believe that a lot of progressives are compromising their principles. And through the book, I do talk about how hard and disappointing and heartbreaking that's been for me. That the people that I work with, that I love, that I worked hard for to develop programs that benefit British Columbians, that I believe in, have compromised their principles in order to make an easy decision. And that, to me, is not good leadership.
Is it getting harder to make hard decisions in politics because of the crucible of social media, because of the mob mentality that you described? Yes, mob mentality has always existed in our society, but I think social media has amplified that. I think in some cases a 24-hour news cycle has amplified it. Like, do you believe as leaders it's harder to make hard decisions?
I do think so. I also think that the role that traditional media has played has changed so dramatically, that citizen journalism doesn't work. It's bad. It's not journalism. It's citizen opinion. And part of what happens now is the role that journalists take in our dialogue and in our conversation, and helping leaders make the hard choices, make the hard decisions. It's just not there anymore. So we leaders get crucified for saying crappy piece of land when no one asked, is it true? Is it in any way, shape, or form really problematic? Did I really hurt people in the statement? Did it really have the impact that the Premier said it did?
Yeah, and that will lead into the reading in a moment. But because you'll address some of this in the reading, but do you not believe that it hurt people? That there were some out there who hear this trope that people have heard before? You're not the first to say it. People hear it and it's triggering for some. Do you not believe that there was hurt in those words?
I think some people were hurt by what they believe was the intent. And the meme, because it became a meme, this is again the citizen journalist stuff, right? It became a meme, crappy piece. She said it was a crappy piece of land with nothing on it. And then I said, it didn't have any infrastructure, didn't have any economy. Like, that's what I was referring to, not that there was nobody there. And so this is part of what happens in an gotcha moment. It also, when you as a journalist ask questions, you ask questions to get some depth, to get some understanding. And there have been times when sometimes we'll say words that maybe don't quite make sense or that come across as flippant. It's like, well, what did you mean by that?
Right.
And then we're given an opportunity to say, right, okay, I have to be more explicit. But there was no chance, that didn't happen. And so others got to tell whatever narrative they wanted about me as the Jew, as the Zionist, who is intent on hurting people in Gaza and so it just became a story in and of itself without me ever having the opportunity to further clarify what I was referring to, which was the lack of infrastructure and the lack of economy on a land that had been ignored by the Ottomans and the British.
So you write about being a Jew. Let's walk through this in our first reading here in the book.
Okay. On being a Jew, I've come to the conclusion that the outrage around my crappy piece of land comment was almost entirely manufactured. Like so much today, it seemed to be less about truth and what is right than seeing your perceived enemy get their comeuppance. As part of my deep work, I was to make phone calls to a number of community and organizational leaders. The Premier's office provided me with a list. They had a staffer prepare what I was to say, the tone I was to take, and they sat with me while I made these calls. When I reached out to leaders in cultural communities to apologize and make amends for the words that the Premier insisted had caused such harm, some of the people I spoke with accepted my apology immediately. Others dismissed the whole thing as a tempest in a teapot. Some had no idea what I was talking about, and I had to explain why I was calling. Of those who were genuinely angry about what I had said, not one could even remotely articulate how my words were hurtful. That's a problem in this narrative. I was told I had caused immense, almost irreparable pain. The depth of work I had to do to repair this egregious infliction of hurt, according to the Premier, was so vast that I couldn't possibly perform my tasks as Minister of Post-Secondary Education. And yet, when I made call after call, asking forgiveness and probing to understand just what it was about my words that caused pain so that I could learn and avoid repeating the error, there was simply no explanation. As a family counselor, I know that emotions can be difficult to communicate, but the context of the pain I supposedly caused was not, for the individuals I was engaging with, so personal and devastating that they were unable to express their feelings. No, they didn't have those feelings to express. Nobody genuinely thought that I was Islamophobic. Nobody genuinely thought my words impugned Indigenous peoples in Palestine or in Canada. Nobody was actually harmed. This was a gotcha to nab the most prominent Jew in cabinet. Those who brought me down still contend that these were deeply offensive words that caused such hurt. They insist I was brought down by my racist comments, but there is simply no standard or measure by which what I said could be interpreted as racist, Islamophobic, or anything other than tactless. It is my supposition that I was brought down because I'm a Jew. This invites a different conversation. There is a great deal of hair splitting around this, and that has allowed too many, including most of my former colleagues, to remain silent in the face of anti-Semitism. I was not targeted because I'm a Jew, the argument goes. I was targeted because I'm a Zionist. And here is the nut of this discussion. This is a false dichotomy. I am a Jew, so I am a Zionist. I am a Zionist because I'm a Jew. Yes, you can find non-Zionist and anti-Zionist Jews. They're easy to spot. Anti-Israel groups push them to the front of the queue to prove their cause is not anti-Semitic because, look, here's a Jew. The word for this is tokenism. Like the joke about how you can tell someone who is a vegan or people who do CrossFit. Apologies to the vegans out there. They'll tell you. Anti-Zionist Jews are extremely vocal, but this should not be mistaken as indicating that they are anything more than a tiny fringe group. A survey published in the spring 2024 edition of Canadian Jewish Studies indicates 3% of Canadian Jews are anti-Zionist. These few loud individuals are the exceptions that prove the rule. For the vast majority of Jews in Canada and around the world, Israel holds an almost inexpressible place in our hearts and souls. This is not always easy for Jews to articulate. It is especially difficult to articulate when we have people screaming in our faces.
So you mentioned in there the word deep work. Politics now, it is much harder than ever before to do deep work in any regard because of the way that things work and the fear of offending and the need out there from the public. Did you ever have a belief that there was interest from the Premier, from leadership, to do that deep work, to understand what is happening to the Jewish community, to understand what's happening in the Muslim community, to explore the tensions that exist between communities? Do you believe that there was ever real interest to do that deep work?
So in the book, I talk about being a bit of a Pollyanna, right? I'm positive. I always, I trust people first, and then maybe I shouldn't trust them, but I start with the basis of trust. People are good. I believe inherently that people are good and want to do good things. And so I start from that place. And I believed that my colleagues were interested in what was happening. I was running around for months, telling them what the community needed. And, we were able to get some money, which was great for additional security. We were able to get Holocaust education coming to the forefront and using it. And after I was fired, I was shocked and mortified and all those other things. And I thought, okay, what am I going to do? If I'm going to be an MLA, I'm still here. I still have a role to play. And my desire was saying, okay, the Muslim community, particularly the Arab Muslim community, is hurting. I get that. What's happening is awful. The Jewish community, I know, is hurting because I'm in it and I see it. And Jews from all over this province were reaching out to me. They weren't going to their MLAs. They were coming to their MLA, their Jewish MLA. So I was hearing stories about Jews in workplaces not feeling safe, students certainly on campus, people pulling their kids from school, wanting to put them into Jewish private schools. And I thought, okay, we have to bring these communities together. We are hurting. If there is a way, peace is about bringing people together to the table to have dialogue. It's the only way to get to peace. Well, let's do it here. And I reached out to Deborah Lyons, who is I forget her title, but she does anti-Semitism work nationally, a special envoy in anti-Semitism, and ran this idea by her about what if I could get the Premier to agree to this project. I called it a project. What do you think? She said, Selina, I'm there with you. We'll help you. You can be a role model. She framed it as a role model for Canada. And I pitched it to the Premier, and at first it was like, well, that's interesting. Flesh it out a little bit more. And so I did that and went back. And the reason I talk about Matt Smith, the Premier's chief of staff, is because he was sort of the conduit. The Premier tossed it over to Matt, and then I was dealing with Matt. And it was, I was like at my wit's end, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna let's push this. And it was the day when I went to, I was invited to talk with them. This is 3-4 weeks after I first pitched it. And Matt looked at me. It was a 10-minute meeting because I was done. And he said, you know what, Selina? Your project, it's just too political. And I knew, my heart shattered. It shattered. I was just I knew I couldn't stay in the caucus anymore. That was I feel really emotional about it because it was the moment when I knew that these people were not caring about what was really happening for the people that we were elected to represent. That's what it felt like to me. And I thought my work here with these people is done. I still have a voice. I am still the MLA. The fine people of Coquitlam-Millardville, who have been tremendous, I still represent them, and so I will stay in this role as their MLA, but I can't work with a group of people who say that working with hurting communities is too political. I signed up to do this work. I don't know about you guys, but that's what I signed up for. And so I needed to leave. And so that was when the decision, that was a Thursday, and that was when I decided I needed to leave.
And you mentioned... You mentioned how people reached out to you, not because they lived in your constituency, but because you were Jewish. And I think this is becoming a greater part of our politics. It wasn't because you were finance minister or post-secondary education
They reached out
minister.
for that too. They all wanted money.
Yeah. Everybody always wants money.
Everybody wanted money. Didn't matter
But
what
it's
it was.
this identity that we exist in politics, and we talk about this in newsrooms. I know it gets talked about like this in caucus. There's a South Asian caucus and a Chinese caucus and Aboriginal caucus and the Jewish and Muslim. Do you think it's healthy in our politics that we are lumping people together based on their religion, based on their race? You know, we're having this debate now that the BC Conservatives are waging about Christ and Christmas. Do you think it's healthy for our democracy to be lumping these groups together around our race or our religion?
Yeah, I think so. Well, we can see the effects of that, right? We're losing the plot. I think that's part of what's happening. So it's not bad to engage in these conversations about people's identities and who they are and how they see themselves. But we were also multi-identitied. So that's part of the problem, is that you can be gay and Jewish.
Yeah. Or a woman and Jewish.
And you could be dark-skinned and gay and Jewish. Yeah. And like we can continue to lump and layer. So we are multifaceted human beings that belong to many different identities. I am suburban, and we used to have these discussions in caucus about who was rural and who was suburban and who was urban. And so there's many ways in which we represent and in which we exist in the world. So having the conversation isn't a bad thing. It's what we do with it. And I worry that we're losing the plot. We are human beings, and we feel pain. And we are connected to each other in a myriad of ways, in different times, in different ways, in different places. So we can have ageism, right? We can have older people versus younger people. Like, we can continue to divide and subdivide ourselves, but it's getting to the point where all we're doing is dividing, but we're not coming together. And it's the part of the formula that we are missing, is the coming together. And it's tearing us apart. And that's, I think, part of what we're seeing. And so I think we need to find a different way to do the conversation, because this that we're doing is not working. So thank you for that. And the definition of crazy is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result. So if that's not working, then folks, we need to do something different. And that requires leadership to find a different way of doing these conversations.
We're going to get to the next part from the chapter, Walking the Tightrope. And in politics, walking the tightrope is something that often people need to do. And the Premier attempted to do it through October 7th, in essence, right until your resignation. At the federal level, the NDP didn't really attempt to walk the tightrope at all.
Nope.
That there was this big disconnect where they have allowed within their caucus to have some very strong anti-Semitic ideas that have spread through that caucus. What was the sense, on your provincial level, you worked with the federal party at times. Where do you think that disconnect existed, and why did the federal party not even try to walk this tightrope?
Well, the federal party is a different beast, I have to say. And I noticed the federal party really losing their way back in 2021 at their convention. Their resolutions were overburdened. They had so many resolutions, anti-Israel resolutions, that was ridiculous. It was just sort of like, forget Syria, Iran, China. You could have a whole list of bad actors, but they were overly represented their anti-Israel sentiment. And I made phone calls. I phoned a number of people who were leaders in the federal party, and one of them was Tanya Jarzibiak, who had been my first campaign manager in 2013. And I said, Tanya, this is overkill. What's going on? And her words to me were, "It has been ever thus." That was all she said. And I thought, are you not even remotely interested in poking in a little bit? But it was just sort of like, this is how we've always been. And I just thought, what is wrong with you? Shortly afterwards, a number of Jewish New Democrats from across the country, we found each other. Most of them, of course, were in Ontario and Quebec. And we tried to figure out how we can use the role that we had within the party to try to bring some sense of balance. And we just met with, we were banging our heads against the walls everywhere we went. We just continued to bang our head against the walls. And so we just sort of gave up. I just said, I can't. And so I really abandoned the federal party a long, long time ago.
Let's get to this next chapter. So this is from the chapter Walking the Tightrope, as you talk about this issue of progressive politics and Zionism.
Zionism, despite being used too often as a pejorative, is simply the movement for Jewish national self-determination. Progressives almost always support national self-determination. Moreover, Zionism has created in Israel an oasis of democratic pluralism, a multicultural miracle, a place where women, ethnic and religious minorities, the LGBTQ+ community, and all people are legally equal. Like any society, it is imperfect. Funding to mostly Arab communities is often not the same as funding to mostly Jewish communities. It's not that different from what other nations struggle with, whether it's differences in support and resources for rural versus urban areas or support for different cultural or linguistic communities. And yes, there is racism in Israel between Ashkenazi, typically lighter-skinned European Jews, and Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews, typically darker-skinned, considered Arab Jews. Israel's far from perfect, but what Israelis have built in 7 decades should be a model for the world. Instead, far too often it is condemned rather than emulated. The fact that Israelis have achieved all this while under siege by enemies who include some of the most racist, misogynistic, homophobic, intolerant, and violent terrorists and tyrants on earth should make it a natural ally to progressives. Rather than trying to eliminate Israel from the region, we should be advocating that Israeli values of democracy, multiculturalism, and coexistence be spread more widely across the Middle East and North Africa. A tiny window of light has emerged with the advent of the Abraham Accords, and even this little light of hope is condemned by many on the anti-Israel side. It is true that Israel does not have a progressive government right now, but we do not call for the elimination of the United States when we don't like their leaders. We do not mobilize a global crusade against countries with truly awful governments like China, North Korea, Iran, or scores of other places. This level of hostility is reserved for one state alone, the Jewish state. When I see the left's obsession with Israel, I can understand where some of the "I told you so" attitude in the Jewish community comes from. However, I do not believe the left is inherently anti-Semitic, just as I do not believe the right is inherently anti-Semitic. There are anti-Semitic people on both sides, and regrettably, everywhere else. However, I do have to acknowledge that after all I have been through, that there is a problem in Canada's left, in the New Democrat Party, in many of our trade unions, in the activist sector, in some social service and non-governmental organizations, and in the LGBTQ+ community. The problem is not so much the strident clamor of the anti-Israel protesters and the sometimes anti-Semitic rage of the few, but the overwhelming inaction of the many in response to those few. Jewish people, including some who have devoted our lives to building our progressive movements, have felt abandoned and betrayed by our progressive allies, by the hateful extremists, but also by the silence of good people. This was true before October 7th. Since then, it has become a crisis. Some insist that it is our Zionism that makes us unwelcome, not our Jewish identity. But for me, and for the vast majority of Jewish Canadians, our Zionism is a deeply held and intrinsic part of our Jewishness.
And that leads, obviously, to a big question of how do we fix it? And I know that many people in this room have thought about it. Leaders in the Jewish community have thought about it. How do you think we address, even if it's just a little bit of anti-Semitism that exists in our politics? How do we start to do the work to address those issues?
So, I think it's, so there's no quick fix. I think that's really important to understand. And this isn't new, right? In fact, it's very old. It goes underground, and what was interesting as I was thinking about this, it's like, the tunnels that were built in Gaza, well, there's tunnels here too. There's tunnels of anti-Semitism that have been underground for a very long time. And October 7th, when the terrorists flooded into Israel, the hate flooded into Canada, the United States, Germany, Great Britain, Australia. It was a simultaneous action that happened right across the board. And so it's going to take some time for us to figure out, how that happened and how do we fight against it. But in the meantime, wringing your hands and saying, we'll stand up against anti-Semitism all the time and then do nothing doesn't change anything. And so there's a lot that we all have to do. And that means standing up every single time you hear someone say something. We've done it already, folks. We've done it around women, right? We don't tolerate misogynistic statements. If somebody makes a rude statement to a woman, somebody says, elbows them and said, not okay. If somebody says something bad about or disrespectful around someone with a disability, someone calls them out for that. We've done the same thing around other forms of racism. We don't tolerate that, so we shouldn't tolerate this either. We also need to, I think, pay attention to jumping to conclusions. And we need to be more curious. So when people do say something, we need to ask them questions about it. What did you mean by that? Can you tell me more about that? How does that make sense to you? Why do you think that and not that? I think it's okay to have those conversations. So when someone does say, Selina, we don't have anything against you, it's your Zionism we have a problem with, I need to not jump down their throat too and say, tell me more about that. How did you decide that my Zionism is somehow different from my Judaism? How did you come to understand that? So I think that we need to all take a breath and have those difficult conversations. I also think we need leaders who are prepared to use the laws that we have. Now, I'm going to use my community as an example. I live in Coquitlam. Every Sunday afternoon, there are a group of anti-Israel protesters that meet at the City Hall, and they do their thing. And that includes graffiti. Now, I did a little bit of asking of Coquitlam city councilors, how much is that costing us as taxpayers? About $5,000 a month when it was at its height. And it's just like, that's not okay. We have laws that don't allow you to do that. We actually give people tickets or we arrest them. You need a permit to gather. They're not getting permits. So we need to have leaders who say, no, you don't get to do that. I know you're unhappy about that. Deal with it. You can't do that. And so we need leaders to actually step up.
We're going to talk leadership because I know you want to talk about John Horgan, and so do I. We're going to do one more passage before we get to that, because you focus in this passage on some of the anti-Semitism that exists inside that NDP caucus. Read this through, but sort of in the back of your mind, think about that leadership question. You've served under two premiers. They had two very different leadership styles. So we'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's focus in on some of your colleagues around the issue of anti-Semitism inside that caucus, or even in some cases, the unwillingness of many just not to call out some of those colleagues. So this is from the chapter, I think, Solomon's Wisdom.
Yeah. There are moments when your soul feels like it's being split in two. In the biblical story of King Solomon, the wise king famously determined the rightful mother of a child by ordering the baby cut in half and shared between the two women claiming it. The mother who abandoned her claim to avoid the bisecting of the child was determined to be the real mother and awarded the baby. I do not have the wisdom of Solomon. I'm also not sure if I am the mother or the baby in this analogy. But in the midst of the crisis between me and my premier and caucus, I felt absolutely torn in two. As I've reflected on these feelings, I've concluded that I never surrendered my wholeness. I will always be the bleeding heart Jew, the social democrat, the progressive. But the people who I thought shared my values proved, when it mattered most, that they and I are more different than we knew. This emerged not only around Israel and Palestine. In a way, in the end, it wasn't about that at all. It was about believing members of a community when they say they are under siege. It was about respecting the lived experience of a person when she says she's experiencing racism. It was about putting aside whatever misgivings, political calculations, and prejudices we might carry and standing with a besieged community. It was simply about knowing what the right thing is and doing it. Or in the case of my former colleagues, not doing it. While my heart was shattered and my faith in the people I worked with so closely and devotedly was broken, when the dust settled, I realized that my values and my various identities have remained absolutely intact. I will always be a Jew, and my commitment to social and economic justice have never changed. Those whose identities were ruptured in this story are the colleagues who have built lives and careers on the idea they are advocates of equality, fairness, anti-racism, and inclusion. When push came to shove, they shoved me out, but in the process they severed themselves from the values they thought they embodied. Despite a world insisting that I cannot be both progressive and Zionist, I know that there is no contradiction in these identities. Indeed, to be a progressive in anything other than a Zionist should evoke cognitive dissonance. To be a Zionist is to stand with the only democracy in the Middle East, the only place where women, LGBTQ+ people, and religious and ethnic minorities are legally equal. To oppose Zionism, which is nothing other than the belief that Jewish people have the right to national self-determination, is an extremist, illiberal position. To oppose Zionism while supporting the national self-determination of every other people is anti-Semitic. While many people took from my experience the lesson that Zionism and progressivism are incompatible, this is the wrong message entirely. On the contrary, the message from my experience is that progressives who oppose or do not actively defend Zionism betray Jews and, by extension, their own values of inclusivity and anti-racism. I did experience a conflict, there is no doubt. But that conflict was not between my progressive values and my Jewish Zionist values. It was between my core identity and other people's values.
So let's talk about leadership. We just lost a great premier in John Horgan. There were thousands of people that celebrated his life. I know you were traveling, didn't get the chance to do so. I want you to reflect on him in a minute, but before that, I know this is something you've thought about. If John Horgan was the premier, if he was your boss when this happened, do you believe the outcome would have been the same?
No.
And why not?
Because he told me. He did tell me, but I also, John is a very different kind of leader. He stood by his principles. And I have often said, and those of you who follow closely might remember his commitment to rebuild the Royal Museum. And he really felt, he's a historian, so he also knows history, which is another thing that's really important. Those people who know history understand Zionism, and those who don't understand Zionism. That's a general rule, but if he believed in something, he stuck by it. Even when people were howling, media was howling, like everyone was howling about the museum, particularly in Victoria. It wasn't as loud here, but folks in Victoria were screaming bloody murder about spending money to rebuild the museum. And he stood up and said, we're building it, we're building it. And the rest of us were saying, I don't know, Premier, people don't want it, people don't want it. And Melanie Mark, who was the minister at the time, she was like pretty shaky, like, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, people don't like me. It's like, don't like what we're doing. And the Premier said, let's wait the summer. Like, we waited a couple of months, I think.
Yep.
And it wasn't settling down. People were really upset about it. And so he went and said, we're not doing it. And here's why. But he stuck by it. Like, he stuck with it because it was important to him. And he recognized, I think, when he was leaving, that he knew at that point he was leaving, that it wouldn't be his project to see to the end. But I think if he was staying, we might be getting a new museum, a new gallery. But so I think he stood by his ministers. He trusted us. he trusted me. He made me his finance minister. He valued the Jewish community. I mean, I have John's stories about the Jewish community. Can I tell? Do I have time to tell a couple of John's stories?
It's your event. You can go as long as you want.
I can, can't I?
If anybody watched the funeral, one friend of John's went a little bit too long.
I'm not
So we'll get Dan up here before that happens. And at least you'll listen to Dan, unlike him listening to the priest. But that's another story.
So we were in opposition. He was the leader of the opposition, and we were going to Kristallnacht, and we actually went out for a bite to eat just around the corner from here. And he was pretty anxious about participating. And he came to me as the Jew in the crew and would run by his speech over and over again. And he said, like, okay, so what do I need to do to be a mensch? And it's like, well, you just need to say these words. And how do I say it? And so he wanted to get the pronunciation right. It's with a ch in the back of the throat, John, back of the throat. But he did that the entire time he was the leader. When he was the premier and we were bringing in Holocaust survivors for Yom HaShoah, he would say, Selina, read my notes. Are they okay? Is there anything else I should say? Who should I meet? Do I shake the rabbi's hand? I said, yes, you can shake this rabbi's hand, but not his wife's hand. They're religious. Like, he wanted to get it right. And then afterwards, he'd say, oh, come into my office, I want to talk to you. And he'd get out his lacrosse stick, and he'd throw the lacrosse ball. I said, how was I? And he wanted to know that he did right by the community. In fact, the Jewish community in Victoria, after he announced his retirement, they held a gathering for him to honor him and to thank him for doing right by the Jewish community. And that was, they'd never done that before. It's just that he went out of his way to make sure that he understood what the needs are of our community. And after I was fired from cabinet, John called me from Berlin, because he was already there. And he was, I'm not going to say the words because I'm in shul, and those will not be the right words to say. They were worse than the other words I used. And he said, I just got back from Dachau. And we can't let it happen again. That was the last time I talked to him. So no, what happened, he would not have fired me.
I know there's a lot of hurt in the Jewish community about what happened to you. I know there's a lot of frustration towards the premier. I know it's taken you a lot of time to reflect on this. You do end the book on a positive note. You want to create some optimism. There was kindness that you experienced. So let's go back to the book for a minute here for our last reading. And I know there was an opportunity to put some questions down. We'll get to some of the questions you've written down in a minute from the audience. But I want to give you a chance to finish the reading part on some of this, the kindness of others that you've experienced here.
Thanks. The Jewish community was overwhelmingly supportive. I heard from so many people individually. Many of them were not New Democrats, and in some cases had not been enthusiastic of my efforts to build bridges between the NDP and the Jewish community. But when I was betrayed, they took this personally. Now, I was their Selina. My treatment at the hands of a government that did not live up to their expressed commitment to anti-racism, multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusion was an affront to them. One of the first Jewish community events I attended after all this happened was Vancouver's commemoration of Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Remembrance Day for fallen soldiers and victims of terrorism. This is always a solemn day of mourning, like November 11th, but this was the first such commemoration since October 7th. The pain was fresh, intense, and palpable. Like on Remembrance Day, audiences are subdued and there is no applause. On this night, though, when my presence was acknowledged, the hundreds of attendees rose to their feet and gave me a thunderous ovation. This almost overwhelmed me, and it was discomforting in some ways, not least because of the seeming breach of decorum it represented. It was discomforting also because I do not feel I did anything to deserve such a response. I had not done something so much as I had something done to me. I've had time to ponder the impetus of that ovation.
While we were gathered to grieve and to memorialize Jews lost in defense of our homeland, we were also collectively facing a separate conflict closer to home, and I was one of the most visible symbols of that struggle. Jews were all living in a changed world after October 7th, where we had counted on our elected leaders to empathize with us and to act not only in the interests of Jewish British Columbians, but in the interest of our collective multicultural harmony. We had been grievously disappointed. Probably every person in that room in the previous months had been hurt by people they thought were their friends, betrayed by dear ones, subjected to intentional and unintentional harms by those around them. As much as I had, each of them had their own individual experiences with anti-Semitism, though in perhaps less public ways, and had been told explicitly or implicitly that it was all in their heads. They were made to feel that their feelings were invalid, their identities were not deserving of the same respect we provide to others. The clear message they had received from screaming protesters was that our people are not as worthy of life as others. From the leaders who remained silent, the message they received was that the mobs were right. They had learned that they have neighbors who think the brutal deaths of Jews are not worth mourning. My community's applause was not so much an expression of gratitude for me, but a recognition that we are all experiencing this together. Although each of our experiences has been different, I embodied for them the range of unprecedented anxieties and betrayals that probably every Jew in the room was going through. I represented in that moment our collective anguish that a province, a country, and a world we thought we knew turned almost on a dime into a place we hardly recognized. In the face of all this disenchantment, we were together. We were not alone. We could depend on one another, even if there were others upon whom we could not depend. This, of necessity, is an essence of Zionism. It is also a core Jewish value. Kol Yisrael arevim zeh lezeh is a concept that underpins our collective identities as Jews and as Zionists. All Israel, Kol Yisrael, are responsible for one another. Their applause was a statement of defiance, of determination that we would stand together, come what may, and not allow any single one of us to be separated from the flock or abandoned to the betrayal of others. We were, in that moment, absolutely unified and unbound.
We're going to get to those questions in a minute. I'm going to take the global microphone off you so Steve can go off and do his things. But while we get this organized, the day John Horgan died, you and I chatted. And one of the things you said to me was, I didn't know who to dedicate the book to, and I now know who to dedicate it to. Why did you decide to dedicate this to your friend John Horgan?
I loved him. The book was done. The book was finished, and we were just doing last bit edits, and it was like, okay, do I dedicate it to the people who elected me? Do I dedicate it to those whose lives were lost as a result of this war on all sides? Like, nothing was coming clear. And Richard and I were crying on the phone together because we knew he was dying, but we didn't know he was that close to dying. And it just, in that moment, it was, he believed in me. I became a provincial politician because he asked me to, in a small pub in St. John's, Newfoundland. It's in the book. You'll have to buy the book and read the story. And he saw in me what I didn't know yet I could do. Whether it was running provincially, being Minister of Housing, being Minister of Finance, he had every confidence in me. And I believe I lived up to his expectations. And I was successful because he wanted me to be successful. So I owed him that much. And I just learned about leadership from him, about trusting the people around you. You give them a task and then you send them off and you say, only call me if you run into problems. That's exactly what he said when I first became a minister. It's like, okay then. And he loved people. He just loved, and I know he loved me.
So it just felt like it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. So I've got your questions up here now, so we'll get to as many of these as we can, because I know all of you want to go buy the book. You want to read it yourselves. You know, we don't have a lot of time left tonight before you guys can finish the book. So we need to get you guys out of here so you can go home and read it. But let's get to a few of these. As minister, what problems did you notice, if any, in the education system that propagate this bias against Israel?
So as Minister of Post-Secondary Education, you don't get into curriculum. You actually don't get into very much, but that's a whole other conversation. That's a different book, the way it's structured. But I've been hearing actually for some years, I have a neighbor who used to live across the street from me, is an Israeli academic, faculty of education at SFU. And she was already letting me know about some of the stuff that she was coming across. And finding out about a movement, and I'm going to call it a movement in our post-secondary institutions, to erase Israel, eradicate Israel, anti-Israel sentiment. And, you know, I don't know enough to really understand if it came through an international education framework, if it came through a regular immigration framework, if it came through in a structured format around funding, because I'm hearing in the States, for example, there's this whole funding framework where money's coming from Qatar and other places. So I think there's others who are probably better equipped to identify how it has been manifesting in our post-secondary system. But what I think we need to do, I mean, I'm probably better equipped to push back, is that I think we need to start our leaders need to start using the tools they have to make our post-secondary institutions more accountable, because frankly, folks, they're not that accountable. We fund them, we give them funding, we subsidize them, and they get research money. And so that's federal dollars and that's provincial dollars. And I think our two orders of government need to work together to figure out how to make sure that our post-secondary institutions deliver what we expect them as Canadians to deliver, which is good education with critical thinking based on proper analysis and reasonable dialogue. That's what they're supposed to be doing, and if they're not doing that, you don't get funding.
And there's a lot of questions here about exactly that, about the education system. So here's another one that riffs off exactly what you just said. As Minister of Advanced Education, did you encounter any anti-Semitism on campuses? And how can student organizations be allowed to allocate student fees to foreign causes like pro-Hamas groups?
So first of all, as a minister, when you go to campus, everyone brown noses.
Right.
Right? Because they think you're the path to more money. And what they don't really know, it's really the finance minister who's the path to more money, but I wasn't the finance minister. But and so the students' bodies that I talked to, they're really, this wasn't on their radar, right? I mean, that's not what they would talk to me about. They were, you know, really talking about their fees. They want lower fees. They want international fees lowered. They want to talk about sexual violence on campus. Those were sort of the topics as I toured different campuses that what they were talking about. What was disappointing to me was the lack of action from their university presidents. That to me was really disappointing. When October 7th happened and we were starting to see campuses start to erupt, I called a meeting with all of our university presidents, 25 of them. And what was funny was my staff said, well, Minister, I don't know if we can get everybody on the same Zoom. The minister's calling for a meeting. I promise you they will all be at the meeting. They were all at the meeting. It's funny when you're minister what happens about these things. And I was really clear that I expected them to enforce their policies. I didn't tell them that they need to take a position on anything, but just that every student on your campuses needs to feel safe. If someone's not feeling safe, you are responsible for ensuring their safety. And I was disappointed because really, frankly, most of them did nothing. They did not enforce their own policies. So they have failed their students, they have failed their faculty, they have failed their staff, they have failed their board, and they have failed British Columbians. And to me, that is appalling.
We got to this a little bit, but this question hits it more on the head. What should the Premier, David Eby, have done to have shown leadership?
Oh, okay, we don't have enough time. Well, with me, I think he should have stuck by his first commitment to me when he said, because I texted him right when the shit show started, and said, I am so sorry I was really sloppy on that, on the panel, the B'nai B'rith panel. And he said, and it's in the book, I'll tell you what it says. It says, don't worry, happens to the best of us. Now, I don't know about you, I interpreted that as I've got your back. That's how I read it. So at a minimum, he needed to stick with that. At a minimum, have your back. We'll ride this out. He needed to calm the fears of my colleagues, and I don't know this because I wasn't at the meeting where my colleagues all talked about me. They talked about me without me there. Very interesting.
But were you invited to that meeting?
No, I was told not to come to that meeting. I was explicitly told not to come to the meeting. We're gonna have a conversation about you without you. Okay? But I can imagine, right? I mean, I know enough of my colleagues. I can imagine a number of my colleagues, most likely from Surrey, I'm guessing, because they have a larger Muslim population. A lot of the imams were coming from those communities. And I can imagine them freaking out about the election. And we can't go into the mosques and blah, blah, blah. And I'm hearing from people, and this is outrageous. You need to get rid of her. And this is me imagining, but that's how I picture things playing out. And so leadership would say, leave it with me, because that's what a leader does. You listen to your caucus colleagues, and then you make a decision, a principled decision, a principled, hard decision. And you stick by your values and your principles. And from my perspective, that didn't happen.
I'm going to get to 3 more of these,
Okay.
but I'm not going to get to all of them, but Selina's going to be around to sign some books, to say hello. You can ask your questions to her then, so there'll be lots of chances to have those conversations. But I do want to get to a few more of these. How can we become more self-reflective as a people and seriously work on the injustices in our communities in the face of anti-Semitism and the aftermath of the Holocaust?
So for me, it's about conversations and getting to know each other, right? It's about getting to know each other. You know, in the book, I talk about things that we all need to be doing. There are things that Jews need to be doing, and there's things that non-Jews need to be doing, and there's things that leaders need to be doing. And I give concrete examples. So I'll give one. So I think as Jews, we have to be inviting people into our homes. We have to be inviting our neighbors into our homes to light the Hanukkah candles this Hanukkah. We are such a small population. People don't know who we are. So let's make sure that we're not strangers to them. So I think that's an obligation on us as Jews. For non-Jews, I think get to know your Jewish friends and neighbors. And if you don't have any, go to a Jewish talk. We have lots of them. You know, go to a synagogue. Go talk to a rabbi. Say, you know, I'd really like to come to a service. What do you think? Organize with if you're a part of a faith community, say, you know, can we just do an exchange? These are the kinds of things that we need to be doing. Don't be strangers. That's, I think, part of you know, what the challenge is. And I think we need to actively counter the isolation that we're all feeling.
And this question comes out of that. You speak about not being shy to communicate. Silence often permeates some of this hate that we see in communities. And this question is, your memoir discusses the harm caused by silence and complicity in the face of hate. How can we address the role of allies whose action and intentions enable harm to vulnerable communities?
So I think, well, it can happen in 2 ways. I think, first of all, we need to ask allies, right? Sometimes people want help, but they don't know how. And so we need to be clear about what that looks like. What does allyship look like? And we need allies to ask us, how can I help? What can I do? What would make a difference to you? If you don't know, then ask. It's okay to ask. We'll tell you. I also think there's ways to create opportunities for each other. And I keep coming back to the idea of making space for people. And again, we don't want to get too involved in how many identities. So we need to have Indigenous representation. We need to have people of color. We need to have women. At some point, it starts to disintegrate and you lose the plot. So I think we need to make sure that we're not excluding and including, but recognize that you can't also get everybody in the room. It's hard, but we have to try.
And this leads to the final question I'll ask from this group. We just went through a provincial election. I know a lot of Jewish people in this province were thinking about what had happened to you and who could they vote for. So the question is, who can a progressive Jewish person vote for in this province?
Oy. I don't have an answer. So this has been my perspective. In the last election, I voted New Democrat. And I voted New Democrat because I have faith in Jennifer Blatherwick, who's my representative, my MLA. And I also told her that there'll be hell to pay if she doesn't do a good job. And I also let her know that I'm going to be watching very carefully, and I will tell you that I already caught her not recognizing, and I'll give you an example, and she apologized, so I have a role to educate. So I'll give you the example. This was on the anniversary of October 7th. And she sent out a tweet that I know came from communications. Like, you get to read, you know what the person wrote, and then you know what communications wrote. And it came from communications because it had communications written all over it. And it was, commemorating October 7th and the terrorism, and we must always stand up to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I lost my mind. So I called her and I said, I know this came from communications, and I know that you're a new MLA. Like, you want to behave, you want to be good, you don't want to create waves, right? Well, maybe you do, and you should. But I said, Jennifer, this has nothing to do with Islamophobia. This was the slaughter of innocent civilians in Israel, of Jews. It is about anti-Semitism. Stop there. You don't have to pair. Communications likes doing it because they want to walk this funny place. It's wrong. She said, I didn't realize that. I said, okay, lesson number 1. Always read the communications that you get, and you decide if you agree with it or not. If you don't agree with it, change it. If you agree with it, use it. It makes your life easier because it's already done for you. But it is your name attached to the message. I'm holding you accountable. I know it came from communications, but it's your name. She said, got it. And I don't think she's going to make that mistake again. But I said, you might want to share that with your colleagues.
I was at your beloved Coquitlam Express's hockey game while you were out of town, and I got this question a lot of who can I vote for with Selina not on the ballot. The community misses you a lot. I know we're going to have a chance to sign some books and meet some people, but I know you have some people you want to thank too. Writing these books is hard work. You need a lot of support to do it, and what you've gone through obviously needs a lot of support. So go ahead.
Thank you, Richard. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming this evening. I didn't know what to expect, and to see a full room is always very exciting. I have to thank this man here, Richard Zussman, for coming all the way from Victoria with his fabulously dressed wife in her pink. Where are you?
She's over here.
Lisa. There he is. To join us. Not only is Richard a fabulous reporter, journalist, he's been a good friend who cares very much about this province as well, and we are very lucky to have him here in British Columbia.
Thank you.
And buy his book. It's really good.
It's hard to find now. I maybe need to write a next one, eh? Is there enough to write about, you think?
I think so. I want to thank Rabbi Dan and Temple Sholom for hosting us. This is really, thank you to all the folks who came to mic me up. Jordana Kornblum and the National Council for Jewish Women for helping out and making sure that everything runs smoothly. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, we have some fabulous Bitachon volunteers. I want to thank them for the extra safety that we have come to depend on. No other community in this province needs additional security. And it breaks my heart that we need it, but I am so grateful for the volunteers who come out to keep us all safe. Thank you. Now, I know that there are a few elected people in the audience this evening. Can you just put up your hands? I'm not going to name you, but I want people to see that there are elected people in the audience. Put your hand up high. Are you the only one? All right, that's Matt DeJonglik, who's city councilor in Coquitlam, who's going to make sure they follow policy. There are a handful of donors in the audience who helped finance the book. I'm not going to name them, but I want to thank them from the bottom of my heart. They're Jewish and non-Jewish donors who said, we want you to write the book. And so from the bottom of my heart, I thank them for helping move this along. And of course, Kathleen Tennant, who created this art, please support her artwork. She has been an ally, and I want you to know that she has suffered professional consequences for being an ally. And I want you all to go to Kathleen Tennant Art and support her. Pat Johnson, who helped me craft this book into a readable form. He helped to build the website, organize the event. He has been a most outstanding upstander, and I am grateful to call him an honorary Jew. Pat writes an amazing Substack about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I highly recommend it, and I suggest you all follow his Substack. I need to thank my family. They sat by my side as the accusations and vitriol flew, and they helped keep me steady and focused on what matters. My son, Aaron Demas, and his husband, Kyle, are here. Leah Robinson and her partner, Omer. They're engaged, they're not married yet. I keep, anyway, never mind. Omer, Gigi. My husband, Dan, who not only wanted to protect me from the ugliness that kept coming at me, who brags that he hasn't been arrested yet, and who has been by my side doing right by me and our community. It's his love and support that got me through what was a hellish year. And finally, to my Jewish community, thank you for your strength and for your resilience, for your notes and for your emails and for your cards and for your gifts. Anti-Semitism is not ours alone. Together, we can help non-Jewish British Columbians understand that this is their problem too. Yalla chaverim, let's go, my friends. We have a lot of work to do.
Friends, just a few quick closing announcements. First of all, Selina and Richard, thank you both. Some would say your experience is a cautionary tale. I would say it's an exemplary tale because of how you handled it, because of your pride in your Jewishness, because of your integrity in who you are, in your neshama, in your soul, because of your menschlichkeit. We talk about being the people of the book, and that is a history book. And the reason why we are still here and the reason why we are the people of the book is because we learn from our history, we record it, we study it, and then we seek greater truth going forward. And yours and this story and this book are part of that canon. They will be taught and learned from, and God willing, we will help change the world with your guidance. And if you want to read that book, you got to buy it, which you can do at the table in the back. It's $30. It's already one of the #1 books on Amazon in multiple categories. But don't get it on Amazon. Buy it here, preferably with cash, I'm told. And Selina will sign it for you. Thank you so much for coming.
And there's a
One more-
max.
and one more
max
thing.
of, yeah.
The proceeds go to charity.
Oh,
Oh.
you need to tell them about the max. Don't buy up all the books, because there's,
Oh, yes.
Oh, no,
So
yeah.
one per family.
Yeah.
I know it makes a great Hanukkah gift. Those you can get on Amazon. But we only have a limited number. And the
And the proceeds go to 2 charities. They go to Parents Circle, which is an Israeli-Palestinian charity for families who have lost members of their family as a result of the conflict. It supports them in their work to bring peace. And it goes to Upstanders Canada, which is a new online charity that works with non-Jews and helps them become upstanders.
So buy a book, have a nosh. Thank you for coming. And it's not too soon to say Chag Sameach.